And the fifth is the introduction of the draft resolution A/Comp 70/L2 by Argentina. Now, before proceeding, however, I hope all distinguished delegates will agree that it is an opportune time and a delight for us to have one small change in the agenda, which is the appearance before us of Ms. Alida Moonen, who will read the Declaration of Principles of the Habitat Children's Conference, and I now call upon Ms. Alida Moonen.
Mr. Chairman, delegates, and visitors, or should we say parents, sisters, and brothers, we are grateful to you for this opportunity of having our voices heard at this conference, which will do so much to determine our future. The world you are now discussing is the one that we must live in. On behalf of the delegates to the Habitat Conference for Children and Youth, I wish to give special thanks to Mr. Enrique Peñalosa and Dr. Hugh Keenley-Side for their assistance and support. And I would like to thank the Australian delegation for their efforts in making our conference possible. Since we comprise of at least 1/3 of the world's population, youth should be involved in the decision-making process that directly affects our future. We do not claim to be experts. We merely ask that you accept us for what we are and involve us in the processes which directly affect our lives. In young people, there exists a certain idealism and imagination that is valuable in the planning and administration of human settlements. What we ask is that you listen to us and recognize us as citizens of today, as well as citizens of tomorrow, and use our abilities to the fullest. We have not had any preparatory meetings, and the suggestions that I will now read to you are the results of 10 days of work by a group of interested young people from different parts of the world. We must secure basic human needs for every person in the world, such as clean water, food, shelter, clothing, living environmental space, basic health care and sanitation, energy, education, jobs, and transportation. It is necessary and possible for every human settlement to have its own supply of clean, healthy water. We would like to support the Vancouver Symposium's statement that if 1% of the world's annual armaments expenditures were diverted towards the supply of clean water, then the world's water problems could be solved within 10 years. With the ever-increasing growth in population and the use of agrarian land for non-agricultural purposes, the question of food production for all has become of major concern. This problem could be remedied if all countries are encouraged to develop their own agricultural base so that they can be self-reliant. Every person is entitled to decent shelter. Governments must have a clear policy defining the provision of shelter with adequate living space and a healthy environment. This should take into account the role which can and must be played by the people, both collectively and individually. We also suggest a major international effort to recycle clothing to those who are in need. The lack of basic sanitary facilities is a major cause of many diseases today. Therefore, governments and individuals must recognize the need for those basic health care and sanitation facilities. We must conserve our present energy resources by using them more wisely. We could do this by designing appropriate technology to use energy more efficiently. We recognize that nuclear power is still unsafe and requires further research before its use can be expanded. It is therefore imperative to put greater effort into research for new, alternative sources of safe energy, such as solar, geothermal, wind, and tidal energies, so that in the future we can be sure that enough energy is produced to satisfy our needs without neglecting the safety of future generations. The importance of education cannot be stressed enough, for it is through education that people are able to acquire the skills and resources which social and intellectual progress can be made. A very serious problem today is the unemployment of youth. Governments must take the initiative to implement major training schemes to train and mobilize the youth. These schemes could take the form of urban and rural service corps, which, through community action, would contribute to the improvement of human settlements. We must develop more efficient, non-polluting transportation systems that will help to cut down congestion in the cities and contribute to greater mobility of people and goods in rural areas. As youths, we do not speak only for ourselves. We speak for the old, the handicapped, and the disadvantaged as well. These groups must not be isolated from the mainstream of national development. They must be integrated into our society and their potential developed in order for them to be contributing members of our communities. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we youth hope that the adults in this conference will go away convinced that the youth have a vital role to play in the development of human settlements. Chairman Mao, in one of his many writings, had this to say: "Youth, the world is yours, as well as ours, but in the last analysis, it is yours. You young people, full of vigor and vitality, are in the bloom of life, like the sun at 8 or 9 in the morning. Our hope is placed in you." Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Habitat Conference of Children and Youth for her inspiring message. I now invite representatives to turn their attention to the report of Committee 2 on Agenda Item 10, entitled Recommendations for National Action, Sub-items A, Settlements, Policies and Strategies, B, Settlement Planning, and F, Institutions and Management. I invite the rapporteur of Committee 2, Mr. Easton Douglas of Jamaica, to present the committee's report in document A/Conf 70/10. Mr. Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You will recall, Mr. President, that the conference allocated specific items under item 10 of the agenda for the consideration of Committee 2. at the first meeting, or the second meeting of the plenary session. The committee was charged with examining and making recommendations on the recommendations for national action, and specifically A, settlement policies and strategies, B, settlement planning, F, institutions and management. Mr. President, the report of the second committee, which has been tabled and which should be in the hands of all distinguished delegates, is brought to this conference for examination and approval. The report, Mr. President, reflects accurately the statements and discussions and proceedings of Committee 2. It may be found that many of the statements that were made by distinguished delegates are not reflected as elaborately as they would have wished. But in truth and in fact, they are all represented in the report. I'd like to bring to the attention of the conference, Mr. President, the fact that a drafting committee was appointed by, a drafting group rather, was appointed by Committee 2. And this drafting group worked diligently, objectively, with pure professionalism and with a sense of cooperation to examine approximately 800 proposals for amendment that were presented to Committee 2. All of these proposals were examined, and they were only discarded when they were found to be covered in one way or the other under items A, B, or F. I would like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, of giving sincere thanks to the drafting group for the very excellent job that they did in arriving at the recommendations to this conference, which are reflected in the rapporteur's report. I would also like to commend the chairman and the Secretariat for the manner in which the conference was handled and the full cooperation and sense of urgency that existed throughout the work of Committee 2. Any matters, Mr. President, which requires clarification, and I'm almost certain that there will be none, can be clarified on the request of distinguished delegates. I trust that, bearing in mind the fact that you mentioned that we haven't got a great deal of time in which to get through the items before us, that the report will be found to be satisfactory to the conference and will be approved as such. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the rapporteur of Committee 2 for his report. And may I remind delegates of the procedure which the conference adopted at its 6th plenary meeting on the 2nd of June, that following the introduction of the reports, the conference should proceed immediately to take action on the recommendations contained in Part 2, Part 1 having been adopted in the committee. Delegations wishing to make brief statements in explanation of vote or of position would be given the floor after all the decisions have been taken. I would suggest that for orderly procedure, delegates should inscribe themselves on the lists separately for each sub-item with the Secretariat. I propose to put before the conference first the recommendations of the committee on sub-item 10A, then on B, and finally on F. But before doing so, may I consider that the conference takes note of Part 1 of the report on the organization of work and summary of the discussion in the committee. If there is no comment, then it is so decided. May I now invite delegates to turn their attention to Part 2 of document A/Conf 70/10, containing the recommendations for national action proposed by Committee 2 on Agenda Item 10A, entitled Settlement Policies and Strategies. Recommendations A1 to A7, including the preamble, were adopted by consensus in the committee. May I take it that the conference also adopts them by consensus? The distinguished delegate from Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. ليس لدي أي اعتراض على ما ورد في هذه الوثيقة، ولكن لدي ملاحظة بسيطة أود
and its content, but I have one observation which I should like to make concerning paragraph 3 of the preamble of recommendation A. I noted that there is some sort of asterisk after a phrase which says must be in conformity with the Declaration of Principles. I see an asterisk, and as a footnote I read, subject to the action to be taken by the conference on the Declaration of Principles. I noticed that the Declaration of Principles, that this formula has been repeated in several paragraphs of the preamble and recommendations under recommendation A1, and no asterisk was made except for this paragraph. And I feel that this asterisk is not necessary, and I trust that the honorable delegates will agree that it be deleted.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Iraq. Is there the rapporteur? I would call on Mr. Easton Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. President. As was indicated before, Mr. President, to distinguished delegates, all of these recommendations, including the preamble, were arrived at by consensus. When the item 3 on the A, the preamble to the recommendations, A, settlement policies and strategies, was being discussed, and on which we had a considerable amount of discussion, lasting for over an hour. The bone of the discussion was the contemplation by several delegates that the inclusion of Declaration of Principles in the preamble might be preempting the decisions that were to be taken on the Declaration of Principles. It is true that the Declaration of Principles is mentioned under other items, but it was because of the nature of item 3 under the recommendation that it was decided that since other committees had also indicated that there was a considerable amount of discussion going on the Declaration of Principles, and that there were certain matters that were to be decided that might affect the preamble itself, it was decided that it should have an asterisk beside it and with a footnote, so that if any delegate wished to raise it, it could be explained. All it means, Mr. Chairman, is that in consideration of the decisions that will be taken on the Declaration of Principles, it will be decided by the conference whether the asterisk should be removed along with the footnote, whether the Declaration of Principles in paragraph 3 should be removed or whether it should remain. So the understanding is that, as indicated, the Declaration of Principles mentioned in paragraph 3, based on the item and based on the topic of that paragraph, will be subject to any decisions to be taken when the Declaration of Principles have been decided. Thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished delegate from Iraq.
I'm very sorry, Mr. Chairman. آسف جدا سيد الرئيس لتكلم مرة ثانية حول
Mr. Chairman, I very regret very much that I must speak a second time. Now, in the first paragraph, I see that if there is an asterisk in the third paragraph, this should go with every declaration of principles, every reference to the Declaration of Principles, because then we would have a document, to wit, the Declaration of Principles, which would be referred to in all these places. In the first part, for example, in the preamble, we read, the goals and objectives of human settlement policies and strategies are recalled in the Declaration of Principles of the Habitat Conference. In recommendation A1, under a national settlement policy, we find C1, and objectives stated in the Declaration of Principles. Therefore, if there's to be any kind of sign whenever there is a mention made of the Declaration of Principles, this sign should be repeated in all places or else deleted. If we mean to say that the Declaration of Principles has not been a subject of decision so far. If that is so, then the asterisk would have to go along with every reference to the Declaration. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Iraq. I can only point out that the things may present some difficulties, but I don't think it changes very much in substance, and as there is agreement on committee, I wonder then if delegates can't agree that that can be accepted as it is. We could get somewhat bogged down if we get hung up on this point. I appreciate the point being made by the distinguished delegate from Iraq, but as it was passed in committee by consensus, certainly distinguished delegates have every right to change these later on, but I hope the point having been made that we could proceed with its adoption with noting the remarks of the distinguished delegate from Iraq. May I take it that the conference then also adopts them by consensus? It is so decided. Now, at this point, having decided that, does any representative wish to make brief statements or positions or reservations on one or more of the recommendations just adopted? No? The distinguished delegate of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chairman, of course, we agree fully to the provisions which have just been approved, but we would very much like that, with respect to the French translation, make a number of drafting changes which are purely questions of syntax. We will give you a text in writing and which will contain our observations. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished delegate from France, and the rapporteur will receive those drafting changes. Is there anyone else who wishes to make statements? If not, then we turn now to the recommendations for national action proposed by Committee 2 on Agenda Item 10B, entitled Settlement Planning. Recommendations B1 to B16, including the preamble, were adopted by consensus in the committee. May I take it that the conference also adopts them by consensus? It is so decided. Does any, I have note that some distinguished delegates wish to speak on the recommendations of Committee 2, which have just been adopted. The first name I have is the Federal Republic of Germany, the distinguished representative of the Federal Republic of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of my delegation of the Federal Republic of Germany, concerning recommendation A2/C/V, asking for implementation of the new international economic order, I would like to remind the plenary that my government had made reservations on the results of the 6th special session of the United Nations on the 1st of May 1974. And I would like to call your attention to the fact that these reservations are still valid. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Federal Republic of Germany and call on the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. With regard to the recommendation A2/C5, the Japanese delegation would like to remind the conference that its position remains unchanged as expressed at the 6th special session of the United Nations General Assembly on the adoption of the Declaration and Program of Action on the establishment of a new international economic order. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan and call upon the distinguished representative of Cuba.
The Cuban delegation would like to point out, as was agreed in Committee 2, has an amendment with respect to 10B dealing with planning of human settlements. The basis for our recommendation is based on the fact the planning of human settlements and its implementation must always be directed towards the promotion, improving the quality of life with full respect for human dignity and the social and cultural needs of peoples. That is why, Mr. President, we should like to make the following recommendation. Human settlement planning must seek to improve the quality of the life of people with full respect for indigenous, cultural, and social needs. Settlement planning and implementation for the purpose of prolonging and consolidating occupation and subjugation in territories and lands acquired through coercion and intimidation must not be undertaken and must be condemned as a violation of United Nations principles and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. May I now invite delegates to turn their attention to the recommendations of Committee 2 under sub-item F, entitled Institutions and Management. Recommendations F1 to F10, including the preamble, were adopted by consensus in the committee. May I take it that the conference also adopts them by consensus? The distinguished representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I apologize for going backwards a little, but as other delegations have, I too would like to remind you of the reservations of France with regard to the new World Economic Order. These reservations were made at the special session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of France and return to the recommendations of Committee 2 under sub-item F. I take it that the conference also adopts them by consensus. It's then so decided. Are there any distinguished delegates who wish to speak to this recommendation? The distinguished representative of Tunisia.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted a clarification for the benefit of my delegation. What happened about the proposal submitted by the Cuban delegation about the preamble? It was read out to us. I take it, since we went on to another paragraph, that it was accepted also by consensus. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and in accordance with the agreement previously, this will be dealt with under agenda item 2. We'll continue now with the recommendation which we have just adopted. Now at this point, we conclude our consideration of the report of Committee 2 on agenda item 10A, B, and F, which will become an integral part of the final report of the conference. I want to congratulate the Bureau and members of Committee 2 for the work they have done so well. And now we turn to the proposal contained in document A/Conf 70L3, which the distinguished delegate from Cuba has just proposed. And I have a request from the distinguished representative of Israel to speak on this point.
On behalf of my delegation, the delegation of Israel, I would like to refer very briefly to the amendment proposed by the Cuban delegation. There are many ways of exegesis to these words speaking of subjugation, coercion, and intimidation. Does the Cuban delegate speak about soldiers that came from a lovely island in the Western Hemisphere to Africa and to Syria? Anyhow, his soldiers are in Angola. Israel is not in Lebanon. I repeat the basic attitude of the Israeli delegation at this conference from the very first day. We are against the politicization of the Habitat Conference. And this kind of amendments is not a great message to the world that is expecting a greater message from this conference. I appeal to to the distinguished delegates not to subjugate to this mechanical propaganda suggestions that will undermine the desired meaningfulness of this conference. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel. Are there any other distinguished delegates who wish to speak at this time? Now I have the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
I'd like to refer to this proposal because in the last few days I've begun to be worried about the attitude of some distinguished delegates here. That is, confusing Habitat, which is a conference which is supposed to look for better ways of helping humanity, particularly for housing. On certain occasions, an attempt has been made to confuse Habitat, which is pursuing the specific objective, with problems of a regional type, which I acknowledge, of course, are very important. So important that perhaps they might even lead to a third world war in the future. And I consider them that important. However, I do believe that this kind of problem, if it's properly analyzed in a future conference or in the United Nations, with people who are more competent in foreign relations and world politics and the whole background of this kind of problem. This Habitat conference is not made up of people with this kind of competence and experience. Certainly in my case, I find myself rather uncomfortable about casting an opinion on this, since this is not the subject which is within my field of competence. All I know about this is what I've been able to learn here and what I've read in the newspapers, etc. It's a very delicate subject, and it really needs people with better knowledge of the subject, insofar as concerns our delegation at least. We have no diplomats in our delegation. We have no political persons. We have come here. We are rather technicians. And it's really difficult for us to take any kind of stand on such a theme of such importance, because these are parts of the world which are defending their interests, each from its own standpoint. Each of them are no doubt reasonable, but it does require a discussion in another forum, and not this Habitat Conference. This Habitat Conference, as I said at the beginning, I think is designed to seek the promotion of man. But I think it would be a good idea, if you want to discuss such an important subject, that those who have to take a decision should be people with the proper experience in the field of international relations. However, the proposal of Cuba seems to me good, up to the point where it says human settlement planning must seek to improve the quality of life of people with full respect for indigenous, cultural, and social needs. Up to that point, I have no difficulty. But further on, I'm rather worried about approving this without subjecting it to more detailed analysis, because the reasons, as I gave the reasons for this before, therefore, that is my position.
Right, I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica for his intervention. The distinguished representative from France.
Mr. President, in my turn, I'd like to stress the fact that the problems of concern to us right now are essentially, as we've seen in the last few days, they're technical problems. I'd like to insist that we remain within the field of technical problems, and that questions which really fall within the political realm should be considered in the bodies which are competent to deal with questions of political importance. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of France and now call upon the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you, sir. As representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, I would like to draw the attention of this conference to the fact that there are some people who confuse our conference with other questions, but without any doubt, this is not the case with the Cuban delegation, nor with the proposal he has placed before us. The Cuban proposal relates to the very objectives of the conference. Indeed, our essential task lies in studying human settlement planning and the improvement of the condition of man living in occupied territories or territories which are not. And we cannot confine our recommendations to territories to the detriment of others. The task of the conference is a human and global task. We must stretch out our hands to all peoples without discrimination. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic and call on the distinguished representative of Yugoslavia.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, the Yugoslav delegation believes that the amendment proposed does contain positions which have for some time been an essential and general element of many basic documents and decisions of the United Nations. Position of the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia as far as these questions are concerned has been explained in the United Nations and in other forums. Our country, 30 years ago, experienced a foreign aggression, a prolonged occupation, dispossession and resettlement of people, as well as destruction of their homes. Mr. President, within the appropriate framework of the proposed recommendation on human settlement planning, an amendment was submitted dealing with an universally acknowledged and widely elaborated principle. Yes, planning must seek to improve the quality of life of people with full respect of their needs. The logical deduction which follows is fully legitimate. It says that planning shall not be misused to dispossess people of their homes and lands. This position of principle corresponds exactly with the predominating spirit of the United Nations today. It corresponds also to the spirit of the United Nations at the time of their creation. Therefore, do we really have to wonder whether in this or similar context reference to the basic documents of the United Nations is appropriate? Hic Rhodos, hic salta. Here is the place to apply, once again, the principles of human rights of the people and of their settlements in a concrete situation. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Yugoslavia and call on the distinguished delegate from Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لا أدري في الحقيقة لماذا عندما نذكر مبادئ الأمم المتحدة أو الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان
I did not want to interrupt the distinguished delegate from Iraq, but again, we are having translation difficulty with the English at least.
No microphone.
I shall presume for the moment that the translators can now hear us and would call upon the distinguished representative of Iraq to begin his statement again.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, sir. I repeat the sentence I already uttered. That is, I don't know why, when we talk of United Nations principles or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or resolutions adopted by the United Nations on certain problems which concern the world, and even aspects which are of concern to this very conference, I don't know why certain delegations explain their views by saying that these are political problems. If human settlement planning is based upon subjugation, on coercion and intimidation, and if this is not of concern to the conference, what is of concern to this conference? And if human settlement planning is not an attempt to improve the quality of life of men by taking full account of the needs of the indigenous population as well as their cultural and social needs, if this conference is not aiming at that objective, then what does this conference aim to do? What could its objective be, if not respect for the Declaration of Human Rights, and if it's not to respect the principles of the United Nations? Mr. President, my delegation wholeheartedly supports the proposal of the delegation, friendly delegation of Cuba. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq and call on the distinguished representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Palestine Liberation Organization strongly endorses the amendment submitted by the friendly delegation of Cuba. It relates directly to the inhuman and colonial Zionist policy which our people in Palestine have been subjected to for the last 28 years. Our country has been invaded and occupied by an alien force, the Zionist movement. Zionism, a European exclusivist movement, established a settlers' colony in our country called Israel. This entity has expelled the majority of our people from their country. The Zionists dispossessed our people and continue to use the planning settlement process, very skillful methods and techniques to prolong occupation and confiscate the land of our people. The amendment, Mr. President, also relates directly to the situation of our brothers and sisters, the black people of South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. Like the Zionist entity, the racist government of Ian Smith and South Africa have employed coercive and intimidation methods to confiscate the land of the natives for the establishment of new white settlements and condemning the natives to the Bantustans. The significance of this amendment extends beyond the cases that I have just outlined. It has a wider scope and far-reaching application for the future. It safeguards against the abuse of good planning methods and techniques. It specifically prohibits its use for the prolonging and consolidation of lands or territories acquired illegally through coercion and intimidation. Distinguished delegates, just imagine for a moment that your own country or a portion of it has been conquered by a superior foreign force, and the new conqueror began the planning and implementation of new high-rise apartments and other forms of settlements for the purpose of consolidation and the establishment of a de facto situation in these territories. My question is, can you acquiesce to the use of settlement planning and implementation for the purpose of consolidating and perpetuation of the illegal occupation of your territory? The exclusion of this amendment means the acquiescence to the misuse and exploitation of settlement planning process. The acceptance of this amendment means the rejection of settlement planning, abuse, and its condemnation as violation of United Nations principles and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization. If there are no more the distinguished delegate from the United Arab Emirates.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, sir.
أنا لا أريد أن أدخل في تفصيل.
I don't want to get into a detailed study of principles and concepts which have been mentioned by delegates, namely whether this is really a political question or a non-political question, but I would like to draw your attention to the following fact. We cannot distinguish between political problems and technical or economic problems. Everything is interdependent in this life. Political questions overlap with economic considerations. And sometimes when you're looking at technical questions, you can't help seeing that this has something to do with politics. So if you go to universities, to students, theoretically, you could subdivide these considerations, but as ministers responsible, we are well aware that in our countries, everything is political. If we are considering technical matters, we know that it does have a political impact. So if we say that the Declaration of Human Rights is political in nature, it's a political problem. But if we say that we are defending the lawful rights of all oppressed peoples, and if we're asking for respect for human rights, we have to recognize that the Cuban proposal is logical and reasonable, and we support it on behalf of our government.
I thank the distinguished delegate from the United Arab Emirates and call on the distinguished representative of the African National Council.
Mr. Chairman, the African National Congress of South Africa wishes to endorse this amendment. This conference, and specifically Committee 2, has been concerned with settlement planning. We cannot therefore ignore the misuse of such planning, which is aimed not at improving the quality of life, but the exact opposite, namely consolidating occupation and subjugation of peoples. This matter has been referred to as a regional problem. This is in fact not so, for the deliberate use, or I should say misuse, of settlement planning in order to maintain political control and oppression of a people, rather than improving the quality of life, applies in a number of countries. I would draw attention to the case of Namibia, where, in clear violation of the United Nations mandate and authority, South Africa is pursuing settlement policies in order to maintain her illegal occupation. South Africa's policies of establishing Bantustans, whether it be in Namibia or in South Africa itself, are the supreme example of misuse of settlement policies in order to maintain subjugation. Though they are frequently couched in words which purport to respect the rights, the needs, and culture of the African people, they are in fact a perversion. Mr. Chairman, it's important, therefore, that when we are making recommendations on formulation and implementation of settlement planning and policies, we do not ignore all the areas, whether they are in Africa or the Middle East, or wherever such misuse occurs. Therefore, the African National Congress would urge all delegations to support this amendment. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the African National Congress and point out there's the African National Council and the African National Congress. The last speaker was the representative of the African National Congress, the distinguished representative of Uganda.
Mr. President, I just want to draw the attention of the conference that in some of the resolutions we just adopted, a great emphasis has been placed on the need to involve the community in the planning process, as well as respecting indigenous values. In Uganda's opinion, the amendment submitted by Cuba is quite in order, since it sets out the major objectives. So I think the conference should not waste time and go over these problems and continue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda, the distinguished representative of Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Sudanese delegation strongly supports the Cuban amendment. If a UN conference like this one does not condemn intimidation, subjugation, and violation of UN resolutions, this will automatically imply that much more resources will go into armament, because every country will think in defending itself rather than allocating resources for human settlements. I think it is a duty of this conference, in order to help solve the problem of human settlements, that these essential issues should be condemned. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative from Sudan and call on the distinguished representative of Panama.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, the Panamanian delegation would like to give its full support to the proposal made by the Cuban delegation, because we feel that this proposal is a very valid one, because the fundamental objective of any human settlement planning must be directed to improving the quality of life. Moreover, because it is based on basic principles of the rights of man and the people, already approved in many documents within the United Nations. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Panama and call on the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. President, my delegation is in difficulty to understand the sensitivity of some countries that are very swift to accuse the motivation of other countries when they refer to problems which are very fundamental to human settlements and human problems. The Cuban Amendment contains, in my delegation's opinion, is in line with the terms of reference of this conference and the UN principles, and we cannot ignore these principles if we want to approach the problem of human settlements in the right perspective. I realize, of course, that some truths are not pleasant, but we cannot keep ignoring them if we really wish to find good and permanent solutions to these serious problems. For these reasons, my delegation gives its full support to the Cuban Amendment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus and call on the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I wish to associate my delegation to the Cuban amendment, and I wish to say that the conference ought to adopt this amendment unanimously, and otherwise we shall be doing lip service to the cause of human settlement. As you know, there are still countries where colonialism still exists, and the case of Somali cause is one. Again, the case of Palestinians and the Southern Africa, Namibia, and of course Rhodesia and South Africa are also good examples. And when we talk about human settlement and then do not mention fundamental principle which condemns this occupation and subjugation, I think we shall be the future generation will look to us as accomplice to these crimes that is happening in our planet. And I strongly feel, Mr. President, that we adopt this amendment